Following the financial success of the MCU, Sony decided to keep a hold of their one Marvel property and absolutely drain every drop of it into making their own cinematic universe. And you'd think that'd be a good thing in the sense that characters like Venom and Morbius do need a darker tone than what has been established in the MCU, as their comic book origins depict them as characters who frequently bite off heads or suck blood. So naturally, they get given the same age rating as the MCU, completely failing to show us on screen what these characters are like in the comics. The release of Morbius many years after its intended release now means we have 3 movies in this Sony Spider-Man Universe, a franchise which has actually only featured Spider-Man in a very brief post-credit scene where he's seen on TV. Its tie-ins with the MCU and other Spider-Man properties at this moment in time is quite unclear, and it only gets more convoluted after this film's release. But nonetheless, it is time to rank these 3 movies from worst to best, starting with People Are Strange. Morbius is very reminiscent of the early 2000s comic book movies where they weren't taken too seriously and the people who made them really did only make them for their niche fan group at the time. These of course were the days prior to the MCU, before everything came interconnected and was actually good quality. Of course, early 2000s you did have some great comic book movies like the Raimi trilogy minus Spider-Man 3, X-Men movies, etc. But the majority of these movies were very formulaic in the sense that they will begin by having a character gain these special powers and his best friend happens to gain the same powers and end up being the main villain of the third battle, and everything in between. It's very, very generic and predictable. So for a time where we have seen 3 generations of Spider-Man team up on the big screen, we've seen huge battles, and not to mention a superhero dab, it isn't that impressive to watch this film in 2022. Another part where it's reminiscent is with its editing, and while some of this certainly is just from the poor editing and decision making going into this film, a lot of it you can tell is from reshoots or where they're trying to take away some things that were initially there, like all the Spider-Man elements from the trailer, which was clickbaiting audiences in the sense because that would be the only reason they'd want to see this film. But yeah, the editing was very poor, and not that it was creating much momentum, but any that it did, it would instantly shut down with this abrupt editing. Jared Leto hasn't had much luck with comic book movies, of course, infamously the Joker, and here his performance isn't bad, his dialogue isn't even necessarily bad, but it's just the film around him isn't good, and it's unfortunate because can't seem to catch a break at the moment. What really does let this film down is its structure, the way it plays out, and the decisions it does take. On paper there is certainly potential with this character like there was with Venom, but it's shut down by that PG-13 rating as it can't fully delve into its true nature of the character. This film fits in with the older comic book movies, but in the modern day it fails to impact positively. And who knows, this film could have had a little bit of a higher rating if it wasn't for those disgraceful post-credit scenes which absolutely do not make sense from what we have seen, and they really do annoy me how lazy they are because it's clear what the intentions are. It may actually be a bit of a surprise to have Venom Let There Be Carnage in second place, as many say that this is an improvement over Venom 2018, and in some areas I do agree how it has a clearer vision of what it wants to be compared to that film. But as a fan of Venom from the comics, I kind of hate seeing him like this. In the comics he's this big menacing presence who's very evil, and here he's a comic relief character, so it's hard to see him like this. But as a casual moviegoer and someone who doesn't have that past experience with the character, I can see why they would prefer this film, as it's campy fun. And to be honest, if it was any different character who I didn't know too much about, I'd probably feel the same. And it does double down on what was the best part of that first film for many, and that is that campiness, the kind of bromance between Eddie and Venom. So it is a very self-aware film, very silly one you can't take seriously, unlike apparently supposed to with Morbius. But it's also one of them, if you didn't like those campy elements from the first film, you won't enjoy this one as much as that one, as there's more of it here. Funnily enough, Venom Let There Be Carnage does play out like a bit of a romantic comedy, in the sense that Venom can't deal with living with Eddie and vice versa. They have their own problems before and eventually making up at the end. And Tom Hardy really does sell it because he just gives it his all, which I really do respect. Despite Woody Harrelson playing Cletus Cassidy creepily well, the symbiote Carnage just feels extremely underused, and that could be down to the 1.5 hour runtime, which is quite short for a comic book movie these days, especially one attached to a franchise. He didn't have the depth or that edge that many wanted, me included. So he just felt like a bland, generic villain, which is really unfortunate because just like Venom, in the comics, he is an extremely menacing and creepy presence. The plot isn't spectacular by any stretch of the imagination because it mainly prioritizes that campy fun that many do enjoy. So you won't come in here expecting one of the best films of the genre, but you may find quite a bit of fun. If not, it just will pass the time for you.
Knock, knock, let the devil in, malevolent as I've ever been.
Venom edges it into first place very narrowly, as you can see, because at the end of the day, I wasn't a huge fan of this film either, but I did prefer having a few of those more darker elements in it. I can acknowledge that from a filmmaking point of view, Let There Be Carnage was better structured in what it wanted to be, it had a clearer goal. As I said, these darker elements is just what I attached to the character, so I enjoyed this one a little bit more. It's a real shame because, as I mentioned, I love this character, so I would have liked to see him done in the way that he is in the comics. Having to put in the mindset not to take this film seriously coming into it is quite annoying for me, but at the end of the day, Tom Hardy really does express himself in a wide range of different areas, and you can't help but enjoy his commitment to the character. This is where it's very unclear because Sony wanted to make their own separate universe with Spider-Man characters, Venom being one of them, and the franchise is titled Sony Spider-Man Universe. But the lack of Spider-Man here is what kind of lets it down because they edit Venom's origin to the point where it's just not that interesting. And like I've said in the Morbius part of things, the PG-13 rating does let this film down as well because yes, you do get one sequence or two where Venom does bite off someone's head, but you know, you don't see anything, you don't really see any of the gore or anything which you'd expect, but I guess that's what comic book movies are these days. A Venom solo film did have potential, but not having any ties to Spider-Man was a challenge, and I feel like this film didn't live up to what it could have been, but nonetheless it's the one we have, and it was the kickstart to this mediocre franchise. Thank you for watching today's video. Please let me know what your ranking is of all three Sony Spider-Man Universe films. Look, I genuinely don't think they should continue this franchise because it's just making things more confusing and adding more movies to an oversaturated genre. It's what Sony sees as something that's making them money, so they're not going to stop, and the continuation of movies getting announced in this universe makes it live another day. So yeah, thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in my next video.